Hi, my name's Kim. I'm a licensed and nationally certified East Asian medical provider and a Taoist practitioner. On this channel, I talk about all things about your health, and I look at what the science is saying. I look at what holistic medicine is saying, and hopefully I give you more ideas so that you can make better decisions for yourself. And we're in the summer of 2024. And it is just crazy out there right now. The whole eastern half of the United States is under a heat dome. 22 cattle in Nebraska have been identified as dying from the heat. We have wildfires. We have flooding. We have, just a couple days ago, we had hail. And not just any hail, we had golf ball size hail. And then on top of all of that, we have this avian flu in cattle. So I'm going to talk about the avian flu in cattle because, since this strain of avian flu first escaped a factory farm in Israel in 2021, it has been causing havoc across the world. And the science, it's been really disorganized. It's been really unfocused. And it's only been recently with this jump into cattle that we are now trying to focus on what's going on with this avian flu. And one of the things that's really interesting or that's really trying about this avian flu is with this jump into cattle, it really highlights that this virus is gaining more flexibility and that nobody wants to say this, but factory farming may be part of the problem. And so let's look at what's going on with avian flu, because I'm wondering if it's safe to eat products that are infected with this strain of avian flu. And then if it's not safe to eat, are there any measures that you and I can take to help protect ourselves? Why am I even talking about this avian flu in cattle? Well, because it's really spreading. And have you noticed that we're not seeing anything on our news stations about this? In fact, in order to get news on this, you have to go search the USDA, you have to go search the FDA, you have to go search the local news stations to find out what's going on with avian flu. Back in March, when we first started hearing about the avian flu, it was in the Texas Panhandle. And I talk a lot about that in my episode on feeding poultry manure to cattle and the history behind that and what's happened there. So there's an outbreak in the Panhandle of Texas. And at that time, there was 33 farms that were infected. But here's the thing. When the FDA tested commercial milk on the shelf, they found that 20% of the samples had inactivated virus in them. So 33 farms, 33 dairy farms, and 20% of our milk supply, commercial milk supply, has a piece of the virus in it. Here we are, June 21st. Do you know we're up to 116? I think it is. Let's look here. 118 dairies have identified avian flu in their cattle. And it was just at the beginning of June that we started seeing this jump into dairy cattle in the Midwest. We've seen a huge jump in how many infections of cattle have happened across the United States. Now, what else has happened? Well, they finally realized that this is not coming from wild birds. And within each one of these outbreaks, we have seen a poultry factory farm near the outbreak have an outbreak in their area. And we've also seen that it's a little bit difficult to clean up this virus. So, with their current sanitation processes, might not be 100% effective with this virus. Okay. And so now they know it's not in wild birds. They're thinking that it's these infected poultry farms that are spreading the virus, and the virus is going through the air. Now, isn't that an interesting piece of science? Because we've been talking about bacteria, virus, and nanoparticles, right? With the vaccines. So we know that bacteria, let's say bacteria is just one size. A virus is 1,000 times smaller than a bacteria, and the nanoparticles are 1,000 times smaller than than a virus. And the thought is that nanoparticles may work with a different type of physics. So they may be so light that they're constantly airborne. And why do I say that? Well, watch my episode on the rise of the avian flu, where I talk about the initial jump from a factory farm in Israel into wild cranes. And then there's a second episode that talks about how deadly this has gotten in wildlife, and how some scientists were talking about this avian flu is going to cause certain ecological collapses if it doesn't slow down. Now we have this avian flu has jumped into cattle, into our food supply. So that's why I think it's worth talking about. And one of the things that's making this a really difficult conversation is we never talked about what happened during the pandemic. We never talked about, was it okay for the government to put these kind of constraints on people, on their businesses? A lot of businesses went under during this time, even with help. Was all of this okay? We completely have avoided that conversation. And by avoiding that conversation, now we're finding ourselves wondering, are we stepping into another situation that could be just as bad or significantly worse than the COVID thing was? So here we have now 118 farms across the country are infected. They know that it's not coming from wild birds. They are looking at the chicken farms nearby because there seems to always be an outbreak of avian flu in a chicken farm before this happens in cattle. And then there's the last piece that no one is talking about, and that is the fact that the United States is the only country that feeds poultry manure to cattle, and we're also the only country that has avian flu in cattle. And so, until they really address that aspect of it, I am really wondering if there isn't a risk with this poultry manure in cattle feed. And you'll see that our trading partners had all stopped feeding poultry manure way back at the beginning of 2000, when they saw with mad cow disease that the virus from mad cow disease, even when the meat's cooked from cows, people could get Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease. And they also saw that with chickens, being that they don't digest all their food, there was a potential risk that a virus could slip through into the manure and infect the cattle. So they stopped feeding poultry manure way back at the beginning of 2000. Okay, so there's the start. What's happening is we're seeing this thing is spreading, and it's not contained. We don't know where it's coming from, but we do know it's not coming from wild birds, and that makes sense because guess what? All the wild birds have migrated out of the United States right now, and they're up in Canada or they're up in Alaska, where they're not having outbreaks of avian flu. Okay, so where are we seeing dairy cattle in our food supply chain? Well, it's not just in milk and dairy products. So it's not just in milk, cheese, cottage cheese, yogurt. It's also in hamburger. So, what they'll do in the United States is dairy cattle that are no longer producing will be sent to slaughter and made into hamburger and sold as inexpensive hamburger in the grocery stores. So next time you're lured in by those super cheap prices on hamburger, it might be dairy cattle. Where has this virus been found in our food supply? Well, the first place that it was found was in milk, right? They found when 33 farms were infected that 20% of our milk supply was infected. Now, that could be from all sorts of things. That could be from us taking an infected batch and mixing it with a whole bunch of non-infected batches. But either way, it kind of shows you how easy it was to infect our food supply chain from a small sampling of dairy farms in the United States. And so if it's in our milk, if there's pieces of the virus in our milk, that means it's going to be in our cheese, it's going to be in our cottage cheese, it's going to be in yogurt, it's going to be in our dairy products. The USDA found that the virus can also be in the muscle tissue of cattle. So it was at the end of May of 2024, one of the inspectors at one of the slaughterhouses. Now, our inspectors, they have to inspect the cattle when they're in the yard before slaughter, and then they have to inspect the carcasses after slaughter. Now, right now, the legislation is that the inspectors have to be at a slaughterhouse full time, and they have to inspect every carcass when it comes to cattle. If you remember back in, 2019, 2018, they changed that ruling in pigs. So at the slaughterhouses for pigs, they reduced the number of inspectors by like 40%. So not every carcass is being inspected when it comes to slaughtering pigs, which to me, I think that's like a bigger problem because, okay, both of these are really big problems. But with pigs, we use a lot of their different tissues in our medical equipment because their tissues are so similar to ours. So if there's going to be a virus that jumps into pigs and we're not inspecting them, I think there's a really big risk to not inspecting every one of those carcasses. So right now in cattle, every one of the carcasses has to be inspected. This inspector didn't notice the cow was sick when it was standing in the yard, but upon slaughter and inspecting the carcass, it did look like this carcass was infected. They pulled the carcass, they tested it, and they found that avian flu was in the muscle tissue. So now we know there's 2 places where avian flu can be from dairy cattle. And that's going to be in all our dairy products, from butter to milk to cheese to cottage cheese. And it's also going to be in the muscle tissues. So if they're using these cattle for hamburger and an infected one accidentally gets through, then it would be in the hamburger too. What the FDA has been saying is that pasteurization appears to inactivate the virus. And from history, it seems that this has worked. And being that it has worked in the past, we can't really say that it won't work in the future, but we really haven't done any science on that. So I want to bring up this article because these were some of the types of articles that I was seeing and that I was reading. And this is from Think Global Health. And let me just read you the title of it because it says How Pasteurization Kills Bird Flu Virus in Milk. And then it goes into experts explain how pasteurization obliterates avian influenza virus from milk. So that's some pretty strong feedback on avian flu. So what you might not know about avian flu is they have LP and HP avian influenza. LP is low pathogenic, HP is high pathogenic. So the LP, the low pathogenic, doesn't really cause a lot of disease, doesn't cause all this rampant death. Highly pathogenic, transfers easily to other chickens and other birds, and causes a lot of death. The avian flu that's jumped into cattle is an HP, a highly pathogenic avian influenza. What's unique about this avian influenza is not only is it doing this to other birds, it's actually jumped into mammals, and it's causing what some scientists are identifying as the potential for ecological collapse in some of these mammals. So if you look at my episode on avian influenza in the oceans, we're seeing this mass die off in mammals and in some bird colonies from this avian influenza. This one's highly pathogenic, and it's doing something very unique. It's jumping into mammals, and now it's in our cattle. Okay, so here it is. There's this article that says, hey, pasteurization obliterates this. So, of course, guess what I did? I went and read the science because I was wondering what they were referring to, because I really wanted to know. Okay, so here's the first one. And this is, let me read the headline for you. Heat inactivation of avian influenza and Newcastle disease viruses in egg products. So does heat inactivate these viruses? And what this study did is it studied one low pathogenic and one high pathogenic avian influenza. Here's what they found. This study demonstrated that the low pathogenic avian influenza, that's LPAI, and all the Newcastle disease viruses were inactivated in all egg products when treated using industry standard pasteurization protocols. By contrast, the highly pathogenic avian influenza, which is the strain that we have right now, and this strain is even more pathogenic than the strain that they were talking about in this study. This study is from 2004. By contrast, the HPAI, highly pathogenic avian influenza virus, was inactivated in liquid egg products, but not in dried egg whites when using the low temperature industry pasteurization protocol. Well, that's a little different than what their headline stated. Experts explain how pasteurization obliterates avian influenza virus from milk. Really a different take on this. And then I went into their second study because I was wondering what that was about, since the first one was so exciting. And what they did is they were testing chicken thighs and chicken breasts, and they were seeing if this inactivated the virus in the meat. And what they found is that if you did 1 second of treatment at 70 degrees Celsius, which I think, what is that, 162 degrees Fahrenheit. So if you really cook your meat for 1 second, it'll inactivate this virus. Let's talk about the inactivated virus that they found in milk, because we actually use inactivated vaccines in our polio, in our hepatitis A, in our flu shots, and in rabies. So an inactivated vaccine takes a piece of the virus and inactivates it and injects it into the person to encourage the immune system to create an immune response. Now, when we give this inactivated vaccine, we actually give this small dose once. The question becomes, with this inactivated virus in milk, is that kind of the same thing? Are we doing an injection of an inactivated virus? Technically, it seems like we would have an immune response. And being that we haven't studied this, we don't know if it's a positive or a negative immune response. We know that you can get too much vaccine and that can create the disease that you're trying to avoid. So again, the question becomes, we haven't studied this. If our milk supply becomes compromised, will we get more and more of this virus, and will that create a problem? Who knows? The last thing that I wanted to talk about were prion diseases. And you're probably wondering what prion diseases are. Prion diseases are brain diseases. There's some sort of encephalitis, some sort of inflammation in the brain. And what's usually happening when they look at the brain after death is that the proteins had misfolded. Alzheimer's is some sort of prion disease. And Creutzfeldt-Jakob is a prion disease. Now, the most studied prion disease is probably Kuru in Papua New Guinea. The problem with prion diseases is, I guess they're 100% fatal. And by the time you show symptoms, there's been so much brain damage that you only have 6 to 12 months to live. So, kind of disturbing. I bring that up because, we have this thing with chronic wasting disease in deer, which appears to be somewhat similar to mad cow disease. And everyone who got Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease from eating infected cows actually cooked the meat. They weren't eating that meat raw. They were cooking the meat, and it caused that disease in them. When we're looking at chronic wasting disease in deer, there's always been a concern that it might cause prion diseases in humans. And in April of 2024, mainstream media picked up a research report that covered 2 hunters that may have died from a prion disease from eating contaminated deer meat. So mainstream media accurately reflected the intent of the researchers. The researchers said, hey, there might be a possible link between the death of these 2 hunters in 2022 and Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease. Both of these men were hunting at the same lodge, and they were consuming meat from the same deer population before they developed this disease, and they also died soon after showing symptoms. The deer in this population were infected with chronic wasting disease. This study, it's centered around the initial death of the 72-year-old man in 2022. He presented with rapid onset confusion, aggression, and he had a history of eating meat from a deer population known to be infected with chronic wasting disease. His friend had eaten venison from the same deer population. He died later with the same Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease. And when we talk about this disease coming on quickly, the friend's death came within a month of him developing symptoms typical of the illness. Okay, so, I know a number of hunters around here that hunt, and you know what they say? Because I grew up in rural America, and they always said, don't eat diseased meat. Well, they're saying, well, no one's telling us not to, so we think it's okay. And I'm just saying it might not be. What the CDC said was past studies raised concerns that chronic wasting disease could pose a risk to people, suggesting it is important to prevent human exposure to chronic wasting disease. What made me think of chronic wasting disease when I was thinking of avian flu? Because both of these, we have very little science on them. We don't really understand them. Both of them, could they cause prion diseases? I think there's a chance, especially because both of them are some sort of infection. The animal is diseased, and prion diseases seem to be caused by eating a diseased animal, a misshapen protein, and that misshapen protein sets off some sort of cascade in our brains. So I don't know where you're at with this, but what if you thought this highly pathogenic avian influenza might be a potential issue in our food supply? Now, the USDA and has been doing a great job of inspecting our processing at the processing facilities, and they're trying to understand more about how this thing is spreading and where it's coming from. So until they actually understand that, what could be some things that you could do to help reduce your exposure? Well, again, right now the USDA, they think they've got a handle on testing the products that are coming in the door. But if that's not enough for you, one of the things that you can look at is buying some of your dairy products from overseas. So buying European cheeses or Canadian dairy products. Another thing that you could look at is organics. And you can actually call the farm that you purchase from to see how they process. What about your meats? Now, where I live, Pacific Northwest, we've always been kind of weird about from farm to table, and we like to know which farms we're buying things from. So we actually have grocery stores that sole source from specific farms. And so if that's one way you want to manage this, you can, and get your meats from a specific farm and understand that they haven't had avian influenza. The other thing you might want to think about too is, maybe thinking twice at getting low cost hamburger. So there's some low cost grocery stores that always have low cost hamburger. I would almost avoid that right now until we really understand what's going on. But I don't know, there's some ideas of how, if you were concerned, you might be able to avoid this avian influenza. We just need a lot more information, right? Okay, so hopefully that helps you make better decisions for your family and for yourself. And until next time, I'll catch you on the other side.